afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the ISO, I'd like to welcome you to today's Greenhouse Gas Coordination Working Group. My name is Christina Guimera, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I will be facilitating today's meeting. Just a reminder that today's call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And please remember to keep comments respectful and professional. To ask questions during the meeting, you can open the participant and chat panels on the bottom right. You can then raise your hand by selecting the raise hand icon, or if you joined audio only, please press *3 on your device. And please remember to state your name and affiliation first before making a comment. You may also send comments and questions via chat to all panelists or to myself. And if you run into any technical issues today, please contact Inteller Events, the host. Please be reminded that commissioners and advisors from state public utility commissions may be in attendance today. And for today's agenda, it includes a discussion on the accounting and reporting approach straw proposal by Anya Gilbert. Following that, we will take a short break, and then we will hear from Todd Jones from the Center for Resource Solutions regarding reporting to the Western Renewable Energy Generation Information System and reporting of null power under an accounting and reporting approach. And then after that, we will wrap up with next steps. So with that, I will turn things over to Anya Gilbert, a lead policy developer at the ISO.
All right, thank you so much, Christina, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. As Christina mentioned, I'll be focused on giving an overview of the straw proposal for the accounting and reporting approach that we published last Friday. But before we dive in, I did want to extend a big thank you to our greenhouse gas accounting and reporting subgroup, which was a group of volunteers from this GHG coordination working group. They've been helping to develop this accounting and reporting approach by hammering out some of the policy details in a weekly meeting. And I really want to thank them for their time and effort in developing the proposals and policies that went into the straw proposal. So just a big thank you there. And with that, let's go ahead and dive in. Let's go to the next slide. So to center us, I thought it would be helpful to remind the working group of what problem we're trying to solve based on the problem statement that we as a working group developed. And I'm not going to read all of the words on this slide, but at its core, there was a recognition that the ISO's market doesn't currently have a way to reflect state or local or corporate climate policies that, unlike a cap and trade or cap and invest program, don't put a price on carbon on generating resources. And so as a result, we also can't optimize a portfolio for an entity to meet emission targets in today's market without market design changes to create such a constraint. And an alternative to having something in market was proposed by WPTF in the working group. And we can go to the next slide. So WPTF in the working group proposed the accounting and reporting approach, which is an out-of-market and after-the-fact report that totals the megawatts and emissions a reporting entity is responsible for. It's essentially a reporting approach that marries contract data with market data to create an emissions inventory. And there's two kind of stylized ways we can think about representing this at a high level. And the first is with the graphic you see in the upper right-hand corner. It's kind of an illustrative example where a reporting entity has 18 megawatts of load, and half of that is made up of emissions from a residual rate, so anything that was unowned or unallocated megawatts and emissions that was consumed from the market, versus half of their emissions inventory came from what the market dispatched from their own and contracted supply, which in this case was a mix of hydro, solar, and a battery resource. So it's kind of one visual snapshot of what an emissions inventory could look like under this accounting and reporting approach. Another way of representing it visually is using the formula below that we've reviewed a few times, but it essentially tallies on a 5-minute basis a total of what the entity owned and contracted that was dispatched that went to serve their own load. And so there's a netting out of what was attributed to a GHG pricing region because that served another entity's load. And there's a recognition where there might be a special climate region for some folks, whether that is a pricing region or voluntary climate region adjustment that allows for sharing of excess. And we'll talk about that more later in this presentation. That total is then compared with load to see if there's still excess to allocate or if megawatts and emissions should be added in at a residual rate. A new term that you'll hear a lot throughout this presentation is the term allocation. And that's really kind of the assignment of megawatts and emissions to either a reporting entity, to a pricing region, meaning California or Washington, to a voluntary climate region, or to the residual rate. And again, I really want to stress that this is all out of market. So it's really taking the dispatch data and marrying it with contract data to produce an emissions inventory. And this allocation is different than the in-market attribution of a GHG award, although we do consider that award data as part of dispatch data when creating this report. So let's go to the next slide. I did want to also include a regulatory disclaimer, which is, this is a tool that can be used for informational or compliance purposes, but it's really up to state or local regulators in terms of if it can be used for compliance purposes, and it's not intended to replace any sort of regulatory requirements without regulator permission. So wanted to stress that this is an informational tool available, and it's really up to local and state regulators the extent that it's used to fulfill any sort of regulatory requirements. Next slide. I think some of us are visual learners, and so another way of representing what this report does is really a comparison, if we just take one day as an example, of essentially comparing what load was for a reporting entity to what was dispatched for their portfolio based on their owned and contracted resources. And so the black line here is really meant to represent the load profile of this reporting entity, whereas the dotted line shows how that load is adjusted based on if they have a battery operating. And because this report allows kind of batteries to adjust their load, what we're really comparing here is battery adjusted load to what was dispatched by the market for owned and contracted, which is represented by the blue line. So in this example, we see that dispatch of the reporting entity's owned and contracted resources largely is close to their load levels. And it's only when there's a delta between the battery adjusted load, or the black and white dotted line, and the dispatched resources, the blue line, where if we see that load is higher than what was dispatched, when load is higher than what was dispatched, that we would add in megawatts and emissions at a residual rate, whereas if dispatch of resources higher than that load, that's considered excess. And so that's kind of the green portion that then is kind of subtracted from their account and assigned to either a kind of the market residual rate or allocated to a special climate region, whether that's a GHG pricing region or a voluntary climate region. Next slide. So now that we've talked at a high level about what the report is, I want to take us back to the objectives that were articulated with the accounting and reporting approach early on, which is to have a report that is able to have a standardized approach to tracking of emissions over time. That is a report to support state and corporate policies by mapping energy and emissions that an entity is responsible for, as an approach that can be flexible to accommodate different approaches for accounting for clean energy, and to facilitate a methodology to account for transfers into a non-GHG regulation area as a result of kind of that residual mix that is serving their load. And ultimately, not to impose on non-GHG regions that don't have similar policies. Next slide. So this next slide is more of a reference that for folks that read through this deck before before joining, or if you read through the straw proposal already, it's in kind of at the end of the document. But maybe I'll just call out a few, just really flagging that the reporting entity really encompasses any market participant that would like to create this report that has participating resources in the market. I also want to call out what the residual rate represents. It is essentially any megawatts and the associated emissions for any unowned or unallocated resources. Null power is any renewable energy without a REC attached to it. And a new term that you'll hear is voluntary GHG region. And this is different than the GHG regulation area or GHG pricing area, which is really California or Washington. The the voluntary GHG region or voluntary climate region is really a self-defined set of reporting entities that are electing to share excess megawatts and the associated emissions with those other entities during periods of excess or shortfall. And I think this is an area where we can kind of dig further into the details in terms of what it could mean if there are multiple voluntary GHG climate regions, whereby different groups of entities are looking to share megawatts and emissions. And there's multiple. It might be that we only have one. It might be that there's multiple. The CAISO isn't looking to dictate the policies around who can be in that region, but we do need to know who those entities are so that we can appropriately assign the megawatts and associated emissions. Next slide. So now we'll get into the elements of the report and kind of click down into their basic sections. But there are three kind of components to the report. There's the registration aspect, which answers the question of telling the ISO who owned what and when. There's the calculation phase of the report, which is kind of the calculation of understanding what should be associated with the reporting entity versus various residual rates, and then the reporting phase that includes reporting out so that there's transparency and visibility for the entity. There are certain elements that are reported publicly, and there may be a potential report to Regis based on the CRS proposal that we'll hear about later today. So let's click into registration and move to the next slide. So with registration, our goal here is understanding what resources should be associated to a reporting entity based on what's owned and contracted. So giving the ISO information on those resource associations with the master file resources, and also greater understanding of, if there's full or partial ownership, understanding what the capacity is of each resource, and what the dispatch assignments should be in terms of what energy should be associated with one entity or another, or what should go to a reporting entity's report versus what should be assigned to either special climate region or the residual rate. And I'll talk about that more later in this presentation. We'll also be collecting information on what resources are considered null power. So again, those renewable resources that do not have a REC attached with them, having that flagged so that when we get to the reporting stage, we can indicate what megawatts are null power without the underlying fuel associated with it versus those resources that are not null power. We also want to collect information on any out-of-market purchases by that reporting entity that they'd like included with that report, as well as any if this is for a WEIM entity, any non-participating WEIM resources. So an out-of-market purchase would be a purchase from a resource that is not in the WEIM or EDAM market footprint, whereas a non-participating WEIM resource might be a resource that the WEIM entity owns or is contracted with, but is not reflected as a WEIM resource to the ISO. So in those cases, we would want to know kind of the dispatch quantity and the emission factor. If we don't receive information on the emission factor, we'll assume a default emissions factor using eGrid state level data. We'll also be collecting information from the reporting entity on what their load is. Again, going back to that formula, we're really looking to compare what was dispatched against load, and so obtaining that load information from the reporting entities going to be important in order to do that calculation. And then we'll also be collecting assumptions for when there are periods of excess generation where what has been generated exceeds the load of that reporting entity, how that should be allocated, and we'll get into that in a moment. And let's go to the next slide. This next slide is also, we will also need information on the confirmation of ownership. So if there are two entities, entity A and entity B, and entity A has a 1 month strip of capacity that's been sold to entity B, the ISO will need to know about it, but we also want kind of feedback from this working group on how that confirmation should occur and what would be helpful for reporting entities. And there are two approaches we could take, and I'm very much interested in what would be helpful. And option one would kind of be a blanket attestation that a reporting entity is reflecting to the CAISO that what is reported is true and accurate and reflects kind of the resource ownership or the kind of contracting that has occurred. A second option that we could take is, I'll call it handshake and flagging, where reporting entities with generators are each confirming in the application that, yes, I sold capacity to this other entity, and there is a confirmation of that megawatt quantity and the dispatch assumptions to confirm that. And there's also some questions for this group around, what if that handshake doesn't occur? Should that impact the final report? So for any megawatts where that handshake doesn't occur for some reason, should that be flagged in the final report as unconfirmed capacity or unconfirmed megawatts that were dispatched by the market that were never kind of confirmed in the application? So this is an area where we will need to have a standardized approach of either there's an attestation that all reporting entities use, or we use this handshake and flagging for all entities. But this is an area where really looking for your feedback on what would be helpful. I've heard from some entities that having something like option 2 can be helpful in kind of providing that secondary assurance that these are the megawatts that exchanged hands and kind of confirmation that everything is tracked. I've also heard arguments for simplicity of, what I've reported is true and accurate, and a preference for option 1. So really looking to hear back from stakeholders on what approach might work best for confirming ownership of any contracted resources. And I'll pause there to see if there's any feedback, but I'm not seeing any raised hands yet.
I'm not seeing any questions coming in at this moment. Just a reminder to folks to please raise your hand by selecting the raise hand function in the bottom right corner, or you can always send us a question in via the chat.
All right, well, I will keep moving. So let's move to the next slide. We're going to spend the next series of slides reviewing some of the impacts for the energy dispatch assignments and allocation assignments. And again, allocation is, are these megawatts and emissions assigned to the reporting entity, to the residual rate, or to a special climate region? And first, we'll talk about this from the perspective of a reporting entity that doesn't belong to a special climate region, and just understanding kind of the basic options for that assignment. For a reporting entity, they can indicate to the CAISO how the dispatch of resources should be assigned to their own report versus should go to the residual rate. And the thinking here is the resources that are dispatched, some of which are dispatched to serve their own load, and some are dispatched to serve the broader footprint. And during periods where what was generated exceeds load, giving the reporting entity flexibility to say, these are the megawatts and emissions that were used to serve my own load versus what were the megawatts and emissions used to serve the broader market footprint, and therefore would go to the residual rate. And so in this first example, we have 100 megawatts of load, but in that 5-minute interval, 150 megawatts were dispatched. And I apologize, the key is a little bit small here, but we have 50 megawatts of solar that was dispatched, 60 megawatts of hydro, and 40 megawatts of a gas resource. And there are different approaches to saying what resources and emissions are assigned to that reporting entity versus the residual rate. And we are allowing choice, but there are impacts that that choice has on the residual rate. And so one option would be the average, to say take an average of the emissions, and kind of the average is going to serve my own load and the average is going to serve the residual. That's option 1A. The second option would be merit order or least cost dispatch. So we take kind of the cheapest resource based on the energy and GHG bid, and we kind of stack those resources, and therefore when we create that merit stack order, it's the solar and then hydro and then gas. And so for 1B, it's the solar and a portion of the hydro that's serving their own load, and the remainder of the hydro and the gas is serving the residual rate. And then we also recognize there might be a reason why an entity might have kind of want to express their choice in what resources should be associated with their own report or go to the residual. And with user choice, we would need to know a rank order of when the resource is dispatched, what resource should be assigned first, second, third, fourth, fifth, if it is dispatched. And in this case, this example assumes that this hydro resource was ranked first, this solar resource was ranked second, and this hydro resource was ranked third, or gas resource was ranked third, and therefore the hydro and solar serve their load before part of the solar and the gas serve the residual rate. So this is the kind of core option for someone not in a special climate region to allocate what serves their reporting entity versus what serves the residual, and providing choice to the reporting entity in that determination. We just need to know which of those three options to choose through the registration process so that we know when these resources are dispatched how to allocate those megawatts and emissions to the reporting entity versus the residual rate. And let's move to the next slide. So now we are going to extend this same model of choice in what's allocated to the reporting entity versus residual and include what I'm terming special climate regions. And I'm open to other suggestions on that term, but really this is meant to encompass if they're operating in a GHG pricing area or GHG regulation area, as we call it in the EDAM and WEAM design, which is really the geographic area that has GHG pricing in place, so California or Washington, or if they're operating in a voluntary climate region. And again, this is a self-defined set of reporting entities that elects to share excess megawatts and the associated emissions with other entities that have voluntarily elected to participate in this voluntary climate region if they have a shortfall in the same market interval. As I mentioned before, I can imagine that we might have multiple voluntary climate regions, or we may just have one. Again, it's up to market participants kind of outside the CAISO's market processes to decide if they want to be in that voluntary climate region with each other, but we need to know that ultimately. And so the decision is really around if emissions are allocated to that special climate region or to a market residual rate. And I see we have a hand raised.
Yes, first in the queue, we have Cameron Reed.
Yes, thank you, Cameron Reed with Puget Sound Energy. I have a question actually on the last slide. I forget, what is the, for the choices, what is the sort of interval that choice is made? Is it made like once a month, once a year? Is it like a one and done? Is it every time you update resources? Like what are you thinking of for that?
We're thinking a year. So it would be kind of this choice on how the portfolio's kind of assignment occurs. That would be indicated to the CAISO, and that would be static for the reporting year just to have that consistency. I am interested in feedback of if there should be any requirements that require kind of that over a longer period of time than 1 year. But we are thinking that this would be, having that consistency for one emissions reporting year, and that could change. You'll note once we get to the public reporting section at the end, one of the suggestions that was made was for entities that are using the accounting and reporting approach to at least publish the reporting option they're choosing, whether that's average, merit order, or user choice, just so that if there are fluctuations in the residual rate data set, that there might be a greater understanding of why those fluctuations might be happening as a result of entities changing their reporting option. But the short answer to your question is a 1-year duration of this choice, but this is done on a 5-minute basis in terms of the allocation, but the choice is made for the entire year.
Okay, thank you. So if like a new resource was onboarded mid-year, would you include sort of the nomination? Is it per resource or is it just, or let me rephrase the question. So you're using user choice. Would you include like the ranking as you bring that resource in? So like say you're bringing a wind resource online, you might need to reorder. Would you do like a 3.5 or kind of what's the consideration for something like that? Or would you just wait until next year?
I think you need to have the re-ranking would need to kind of include that resource so we know where it should be included, and that will be an impact for, new contracts or new resources through the year. It's just, we're not going to switch from using merit order on May 22nd and user choice on May 23rd and average on, May 24th. The kind of key choice or kind of reporting choices for the year, but the calculation is done on a 5-minute interval. Any new resource that comes online, whether that's owned or contracted, would have to use this same approach that's selected for the entire year.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
Great. So this next section is extending this framework to include pricing regions and voluntary climate regions, or the residual rate. And let's go to the next slide. So this is also going to mirror what we just talked about, where option 1 here is based on an average. But here there is the election of, under the average approach, to either the applicable GHG pricing region or voluntary climate region, or the residual rate. Something I've noted in the straw proposal is I don't see a rationale for splitting between kind of a GHG region, whether that's priced or voluntary, and the residual rate. And so this, at least under the average approach, we are asking entities to elect to having the excess allocated to either a pricing region or voluntary region, or the residual rate. But I'm curious to hear from stakeholders if there is a reason why there would be a split. But if you're just doing it based on the average of emissions that are dispatched, I'm unclear what the policy rationale would be for that split. So that's a note you'll see in the straw proposal, but recognizing that excess could either go to that pricing region or voluntary region if applicable, or to the residual rate. Next slide. The second option is allocating excess based on least cost dispatch. So it's very similar to what we saw before. And again, this is based on the combination of the energy and GHG bids, but wanting to understand, should that excess go to a GHG region, whether that's priced or voluntary, or should it be allocated to the residual rate? And so that's information we'll be seeking as part of the registration process for those that are either in a priced region or voluntary climate region. And then if we move to the next slide. And then the third option, if the entity is in a pricing region or voluntary climate region, is allowing user choice in terms of what resources would be allocated to the GHG pricing region or voluntary climate region versus what resources would be allocated to the residual rate. And in this example, we're seeing that the entity, kind of using a rank order choice, has said, in periods that I have excess, I want X resources, and in this case, solar, allocated to the GHG pricing region or voluntary climate region, and my gas resource allocated to the residual rate. So again, just extending the choice that reporting entities have in terms of what megawatts and emissions serve their own load versus a pricing region or voluntary climate region versus a broader residual rate. Any questions before we move on to how to allocate emissions for non-participants?
I'm not seeing, oh, we just got a hand raised from Elisa Casewater.
Okay, great. Alyssa, go ahead.
Hey, Anya, this is Alyssa Casewater with Bonneville. Can you go back to the previous slide? I just want to make sure that I understand what you're proposing correctly. So if you're using the average method to calculate your excess generation and how that would go into the residual, or the, I guess, residual for the climate, one of the special climate regions, the proposal is that you would pick that either went into the residual market mix or it went into the special climate region. It couldn't be split between the two.
Yes, and let's actually go back to option 1, which is the average. So if we could go back one more slide. Yes, the proposal is, if someone's using an average approach, maybe I would just like to better understand the rationale for kind of splitting that excess between kind of the special climate region and the broader residual rate, if someone's using the average approach, you know, open to feedback there, but the proposal is, you know, either allocating it to the special climate region or the residual rate.
Right. You'd pick one or the other, but not
Correct.
both for your proposal. Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right.
I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
All right, let's go ahead and move forward another slide. So let's now talk about how to assign or allocate emissions for an entity that's not using the report. And you might recall that the ISO had taken a position previously for non-participants of assigning everything to the residual rate. And we had heard a lot of feedback from the working group and the subgroup to kind of find a methodology to assign large owned resources. And we still had concerns about being able to really map that accurately, given a lack of information for contract purposes of who owns what, if there's any sort of contracting of those megawatts. And so instead, the subgroup developed a method by which we would look at this really in terms of, for the BAA, in terms of what was dispatched. So non-participating BAA's generation is assumed to meet their load. And any excess that was generated in an interval beyond the BAA's load would go to the residual rate on an average basis. We also developed a methodology that if a BAA is a mix of reporting entities and non-reporting entities, that we would have a method to allocate the non-participant portion to the residual rate if there was excess. And that's what this formula shows, essentially taking the difference between generation and load to determine that excess quantity. And if we go to the next slide, we can have more of a visual representation of this from a non-participant BAA. And again, here's kind of the simplified example where the BAA load is 100 megawatts. The dispatch of that BAA is 150 megawatts. And for the non-participants, we're always going to take the average approach. So the average of what was dispatched is allocated to that BAA, and it's really the remainder that is either assigned to the pricing region or to the broader residual rate if that BAA does not overlap with California or Washington. So this is a case where, again, anytime that BAA overlaps with Washington or California, it would be assigned to the pricing region's area of excess, whereas if it does not overlap a GHG pricing region, it would just be allocated to the broader residual rate. I'll pause there and see if there's any questions. Yes, Andrew, go ahead.
Hi, Anya, thanks. I just had a clarifying question about this, and I'm looking at the straw proposal. I think this is page 15. The text here says, any excess will be the residual contribution from the non-participating entity in the BAA and will be based on the average emissions rate of what served that BAA in the market interval, which aligns with this, but I'm just confused a little bit about the wording. When you say what served the BAA in that market interval, is that what served that BAA from the non-participating entities, or what served the BAA in total, like from all entities within the BAA?
I might need to read that one more time because that might be the language used for non-participants if we go back to slide 20. But what we're showing on the kind of the visual representation slide is really assuming that there isn't a split in the BAA between participants and non-participants. Whereas the formula is trying to show how would we come up with the excess for non-participant load if the BAA was split between reporting entities and non-reporting entities. So maybe I can follow up with you offline on that exact language, but the visual representation we were just going over on slide 21 does not assume a mix of reporting and non-reporting. This is just
Okay.
under the assumption of a BAA that is wholly non-reporting.
That is wholly non-reporting. Okay, that's helpful. Great. Okay. And yeah, I would love to follow up. We can take it offline. Thank you.
Sounds good. And if you wouldn't mind sending that sentence over my way, that'd be helpful.
Yep, will do.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you.
And I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
Okay, sounds good. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So wanted to provide an overview of some of the fuel assumptions. Some of the feedback that we heard from the subgroup was to recognize state reporting largely uses EIA and EPA emissions factor data, and to continue that approach for consistency purposes. And so for fuel-based resources, the starting assumption is to use the EIA or EPA data for those fuel-based resources. You would use a zero emissions factor for intermittent renewables, so your wind and solar resources. We would allow a reporting entity to determine their emissions factor for any hydro resource. And then there's a couple of variations for storage. So for purely standalone storage, we would treat it as a load adjustment. But then there's some cases where storage has another resource paired with it. And for hybrid resources, CAISO models these as one resource ID. And so it's hard for us to distinguish what the storage resource is doing versus the resource it is paired with. And so for hybrid, the assumption we'll use is that they're charging from the on-site resource, and we will use that emissions factor unless they're a net buyer from the market. And in that case, we will treat them as a load adjustment. Co-located resources, we model and see as two different resources. And we also have a flag that indicates when they can't charge from the grid called OGCI or off-grid charge indicator. And when they tell us and raise their hand and say, I'm not charging from the grid because this OGCI flag is active, we'll use that kind of co-located resources emissions factor. However, for intervals where that flag is inactive, we will treat that resource as a load adjustment. So for storage, think of it as, when we have information of a co-located resource or another resource acting alongside of it, we will use that. And in other instances, we will treat it as a load modification. And then for demand response, we will also treat that as a load adjustment. Next slide. So this slide is intended to kind of put some of these pieces together. This is also included in the paper. What I want to highlight here is this puts together the pieces of an entity one that doesn't participate in a pricing region or doesn't reside in a pricing region or doesn't participate in a voluntary climate region. And in this case, we have a resource that isn't long or short. And they actually have some or 50 megawatts that are serving entity 4. And then entity 2, 3, and 4 are located in a pricing region. And what this example shows is how the reporting option chosen and kind of participating in this pricing region allows for sharing of entities that are long with entities that are short. And so in this case, we have entity 2 that is using the least cost dispatch approach. They are long by 50 megawatts. And because of the approach they have taken, it's really their gas resource that has 50 megawatts of excess at a 0.4 emissions factor. And then we have entity 3 that had 50 megawatts of excess. They're a non-participant BA that's participating, or they're a non-participant located in a pricing region, so we're taking an average approach for that excess. And so they're contributing 50 megawatts at 0.092, and then the average of entity 2 and 3 is then later consumed by entity 4 when they are short by 50 megawatts. That same approach extends with the voluntary climate region. We essentially have entity 5 that is long by 100 megawatts and entity 6 that's short by 100 megawatts. And because entity 5 has elected their clean resources to serve the voluntary climate region, it's that 100 megawatts of clean solar that is serving entity 6. So you can take a closer look at this in the straw proposal, but wanted to give a sense of how this sharing occurs and how the reporting option selected when there is excess generation beyond load impacts that sharing. Next slide. So lastly, we'll get into just the data sharing. And this is an area where we, in all areas, we'd like feedback, but particularly this reporting area. For data that is reported to the reporting entity itself, we would reflect back kind of their registration information. We'd also reflect back what their dispatch information was, and then also supporting metrics. And that would include kind of their option of either just receiving the data that supports or kind of underpins the residual rate, kind of, or their weighted average of emissions each hour for what their portfolio produced. So looking to give flexibility there on what information they would like to receive. Next slide. And then for publicly reported data, we would publish a greenhouse gas report with aggregated volumes and emissions by fuel type. And then both on a quarterly and annual basis, we'd have a null power report. And for that quarterly report, we'd have the hourly volumes of null power that don't have the underlying fuel type or emissions profile. And then on an annual basis, we would have aggregated volumes of null power by fuel type. And then we would also report out on the reporting entity option selected for excess power. So is it based on average, least cost dispatch or merit order, or based on user choice? Next slide. And this actually might be a good place to pause for questions before we go to Todd's presentation. I realize we're ending a little early and ahead of schedule, but want to allow for some time for questions.
Just a reminder to folks, if you have any questions, please raise your hand by selecting the raise hand icon at the bottom right of your screen. If you have trouble raising your hand, you can always chat in a question as well, and we can read it for you. Not seeing any questions coming in quite yet.
All right, well, maybe with that, we can take a quick break and then move over to Todd's presentation.
Great, we will take a break and return in approximately 10 minutes. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Hi, everyone. We'll now be returning to hear CRS proposal to CAISO for reporting to Regis and reporting of null power under an accounting and reporting approach from Todd Jones at CRS.
Hi, thanks so much. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Thanks again. My name is Todd Jones. I'm with Center for Resource Solutions. I just want to thank CAISO for including our proposal in this draw proposal and for the opportunity to present it today. And I also want to thank the subgroup for helping us refine it and for feedback to date. For those who are not familiar with CRS, CRS is a nonprofit organization established in 1997 that creates policy and market solutions to advance sustainable energy. We focus on policy and market development, certification, and education. And we run the Greenie Standard and Certification Program, which is the leading standard and certification for voluntary renewable energy in North America. We provide technical guidance and programmatic support to states and utilities and tracking systems and a wide variety of others, primarily in the areas of renewable energy program design, electricity product disclosures, and GHG reporting and accounting. We put together these proposals for reporting to Regis and options for reporting of null power under the accounting and reporting approach in order to address concerns that we have related to the risk of double counting renewable energy attributes through the framework, which I will explain. Our proposal document itself, which is Appendix A of the straw proposal, that document is organized with our actual proposals to CAISO at the top for convenience, followed by a table of generation scenarios and the reporting and data sharing rules or outcomes under the things that we propose. And then finally, explanations of the proposals and some additional information at the end. Next slide. But today, I will present that information in a slightly different order. First, I'll explain why this accounting and reporting framework should account for RECs and null power and share allocation data with Regis and why that meets the goals of the framework and the entities that would use it. I'll run through an example calculation, and then I'll describe our proposals to CAISO for reporting to Regis and null power reporting, and then I'll explain the reasoning behind them. I'll run through a few scenarios to show how those proposals would play out for different generation. And finally, I'll address some frequently asked questions about policy neutrality, the advantages of our proposal for both programs that use RECs and emissions accounting programs that don't use RECs, as well as confidentiality concerns. So next slide. All right, so first, just want to level set and talk about why the accounting and reporting approach should account for RECs. Next slide. All right, so just a quick grounding here. A REC, a renewable energy certificate, represents 1 megawatt hour of renewable electricity delivered to the grid. It includes fuel type, emissions, and other attributes. Once issued, it can be tracked and traded independently from the power. Regis, the Western Renewable Energy Generation Information System, issues these certificates using verified meter data. RECs are the standard instrument for proving delivery and use of renewable energy, delivery and use of electricity with the attributes of the renewable resource on the grid. They're used in compliance and voluntary programs to verify supplier and consumer renewable energy and emissions claims. They are required for federal tax credits, clean transportation programs, load serving entity emissions reporting, and corporate emissions disclosures. Importantly, while states and programs have different rules about whether RECs must be bundled with power, et cetera, the REC always carries the exclusive claim to the renewable and emissions attributes. And under federal guidance, if a REC is sold or separated from the electricity, that electricity can no longer be reported as renewable. It must be reported as what is called null power. And here's sort of where the problem starts. The accounting and reporting framework assigns fuel type and emissions data from generators to reporting entities, including load-serving entities. But the generation they're being assigned could include renewable generation that is registered in Regis and has RECs associated with it. And that means the same renewable generation could be claimed potentially in two places for the reporting entity, for reporting renewable energy or zero emissions electricity or both. Once by the LSE receiving the accounting and reporting allocation, and again by whoever owns and retires the REC in Regis. This is sort of a textbook example of double counting. So for example, imagine a Colorado utility owns a wind generator. That utility participates in CAISO's accounting and reporting framework, and the market allocates the wind generation and its emissions to that utility's load. But the utility sells the RECs to, let's say, an Oregon utility, which retires them in Regis to meet its RPS. So now you've got two LSEs in two states, both claiming the same wind power. That undermines both claims, obviously. So in other words, this accounting and reporting framework risks operating in parallel to Regis. It creates potentially conflicting claims that then regulators, utilities, and program administrators will have to sort of untangle. And if emissions attributes are separated from the RECs, that's what is called disaggregation. Regis rules require the certificate to be removed from circulation and in order to prevent inconsistencies. And then if CAISO allocates emissions without regard for REC ownership, it sort of not only risks regulatory confusions, but it potentially infringes on the rights of the REC holders, creating liability for LSEs and eroding trust in both emissions tracking and renewable energy programs. So now I know the question might be, isn't this a state problem? Neither CAISO nor Regis are making or enforcing renewable energy or emissions claims. You heard Anya's disclaimer at the beginning of today's meeting. The states define what counts. The answer is yes, but CAISO's framework will provide the information and the foundation for regulatory enforcement and claims. The accounting and reporting framework is intended to enable emissions accounting by load-serving entities in the market and calculate a residual mix that can replace, for example, default emissions factors. So CAISO should avoid creating conflicting allocation and tracking systems that create regulatory confusion and lead to double counting. So CAISO's framework should not default to data that conflicts and that regulators and voluntary programs have to manage. At a minimum, CAISO should ensure that emissions and attribute allocations in this accounting and reporting framework are transparent to and ideally aligned with REC ownership in Regis. Otherwise, we risk building two conflicting systems, one based on allocation of energy in the market and the other based on certificates, each of which tells sort of a different story about who gets what and what the associated emissions are. So next slide. So now let's just talk about why accounting for RECs doesn't mess up the accounting or is accurate for what the framework is trying to achieve. Next slide. We've heard concerns from folks that accounting for RECs and null power might mess up the accounting or overcount emissions, particularly because RECs are transacted along different timeframes than the real-time and day-ahead markets. And that as a result, we should distinguish, or we must distinguish between load-based emissions accounting and REC accounting and policies. But accurate load-based emissions accounting must account for all transactions, including attribute transactions that occur over longer time periods and to entities outside of the market. Otherwise, you misrepresent what was actually delivered to load, who actually used the clean power, and you risk double counting attributes. That may necessitate accounting mechanisms like null power and produce a load-based emissions total that doesn't align with emissions from generation in the market during a given time period. Now, that's not a problem. It's the result of correctly allocating emissions to the parties responsible for using them during the time period. Next slide. So let's just go through an example. Next slide. So in this example, we have 3 LSEs participating in the accounting and reporting framework with a total load of 1,000 megawatt hours. Total generation in the market equals 1,400 megawatt hours. And the mix of generation looks like this. So you have 200 megawatt hours of solar, 100 megawatt hours of wind, 150 megawatt hours of hydro, 600 megawatt hours of natural gas, 350 megawatt hours of coal, with emissions factors for the natural gas and coal shown. And we can see that the RECs associated with the wind have been sold to a third party. So next slide. All right, so step 1 is allocating the generation to LSEs and the residual mix. So in this simplified example, this is a simplified example, owned and contracted generation gets allocated to the LSEs, and the rest, meaning the excess that's not needed by the LSEs to meet load, or uncontracted and unowned generation, goes to the residual mix. It assumes that non-participating also goes to the residual mix rather than the BAA, as Anya presented. There's also no attribution to GHG pricing zones and no voluntary climate regions. I also didn't get into the different scenarios for which generation was selected to be excess in this example. I just chose some generation. I'm trying to just illustrate what happens with the null power. So on the left is the owned and contracted generation by resource type allocated to each LSE, totaling to 1,000 megawatt hours. And you can see that the wind power has been designated as null, corresponding to the fact that the wind RECs have been sold to a third party. We'll go through our proposal for reporting null power under this accounting and reporting framework immediately after this, but the null power is reported either because CAISO requires the REC information and didn't receive it. The wind RECs were not reported to CAISO, or because the reporting entities all optionally reported the wind volumes as null power. Either way, it's reported as null power in this example. And then on the right is the residual mix generation by resource type, totaling to 400 megawatt hours. And there's some null power in the residual mix as well. So next slide. All right, so step 2 is calculating the residual mix emissions rate. You have the amount of gas and coal in the residual mix times their emissions factors. We also have the total number of megawatt hours of fossil in the residual mix and the total number of megawatt hours of null power in the residual mix. So we can calculate a null power adjusted residual mix emissions rate. We do this by excluding the null power megawatt hours from the denominator. So taking the total emissions and dividing by 360 megawatt hours of fossil generation, assigning emissions to the null power in the residual mix would be circular. It would be assigned the residual mix emissions rate, or we'd have to select some other rate to assign to it. So we simply exclude it, removing the megawatt hours from the denominator. I also put here an unadjusted residual mix emissions rate. So the total emissions divided by 400 megawatt hours of total generation in the residual mix, which you can see produces a smaller rate. So yeah, the adjusted residual mix is higher because the denominator is smaller. All emissions from generation are captured, but the residual rate, what is used for null power and unspecified market purchases, is higher in the adjusted case because some clean power that would otherwise be in there has been otherwise allocated outside of the market boundary, the temporal or geographical boundary, and therefore not allocated here. Next slide. So the next step is to calculate LSE emissions. And we do this by using the emissions factor of the emitting generation and assigning the null power adjusted residual rate to the null power. So you can see the totals here for LSEs A, B, and C, assigning that 1433.25 pounds per megawatt hour null power adjusted residual rate to the null power in their portfolios. Next slide. Okay, so next step is to calculate total emissions. So if we just add up all the emissions from generation in the market during the reporting period, we get this 1.3 million pounds of CO2. And then you can also see that if we add up LSE emissions from specified power and the emissions from generation in the residual mix, we get the same number, this 1.3 million pounds of CO2. But if we add up all allocated emissions, which is equal to the sum of the LSE allocated emissions for their combined 1,000 megawatt hours, and remember the null power was assigned the residual rate, the null power adjusted residual rate, and the emissions assigned to the other 400 megawatt hours of generation, which also gets the residual rate. If we add up those two, then we get a different number, around 1.4 million pounds of CO2. Next slide. So there's a difference then between total generator emissions and total allocated emissions, and total allocated emissions is greater. And this is because, again, some zero emitting generation in the form of RECs were held or transacted outside of the market and reported as null power with emissions rather than zero emissions during the reporting period. Those RECs may be allocated over a different time period or geography. So in other words, clean power gets allocated outside of the temporal and geographic boundaries. The extra emissions that get allocated to the null power are real. They occur outside of the boundaries, and they will be, for lack of a better word, offset by clean energy allocations in the form of RECs later or elsewhere or both. So that total system emissions are correct over a long enough period of time, the period of time over which the transactions occur. So this, perceived problem of a delay or movement of emissions, the extent that there is one, is sort of minor compared to double counting the emissions associated with renewable energy, which would be actually inaccurate and undercount total system emissions. So that sort of leads into our two proposals. Next slide. So first is our proposal for reporting to Regis. Our proposals are divided into two parts. Our proposal for sharing allocation data with Regis and our proposal for reporting of null power under this framework. So next slide. So first, the proposal for reporting to Regis. We're proposing that CAISO provides to Regis, for each Regis registered generating unit, the quantity of electricity in a given month for each hour of a month that was bid into the market and allocated on a resource-specific basis. And I tried to list here, as best as I know now, the different places where generation can be allocated to on a resource-specific basis, either to a reporting entity, either a BAA if it's not participating, a GHG pricing zone residual mix, the voluntary climate region residual mix, or the market residual mix. And to facilitate that data sharing, we're recommending a monthly report to Regis that provides, again, for each Regis registered generator, the total hourly allocated volume for a given month by reporting entity or BAA or pricing zone or voluntary climate region or residual mix, wherever it's been allocated to on a resource specific basis. And then obviously we'll need to consult with Regis on the details related to the format and the transfer of the data. And this last bullet basically just says that allocations to reporting entities or these other places on a resource specific basis should be in alignment with the attribution or the deeming in market to GHG pricing zones where applicable, so that generation attributed to a zone cannot be allocated to an entity or a residual mix outside of that zone or to the market residual mix. So for consistency between attribution and allocation. So just to sort of summarize this, for Regis renewables allocated on a resource specific basis through this accounting and reporting framework, Regis should receive generator specific allocation data. As I said before, this transparency is essential because the allocation data pertains to the same attributes that are included in the certificates, and it may impact the claims of certificate holders. Now, sort of what would Regis do with this data? Regis, we're proposing that to Regis that they should tag the associated RECs with that CAISO allocation information so that each state or voluntary program that uses Regis certificates can then determine for itself whether those RECs are eligible, having that CAISO allocation data available to them. Ideally, they would ensure that the RECs are distributed or transferred in alignment with the allocations under this framework in order to prevent double counting. But this would just provide transparency and it would leave open to those programs and states the ability to do with that information as they please. So in order for that to happen, Regis needs this generator specific allocation data from CAISO prior to REC issuance. And Regis mints RECs on an ongoing basis, typically 2 weeks after data is reported or earlier if the data is approved by the customer. So we're proposing a monthly report to Regis, and we would, ask Regis to change its issuance rules such that if the generator participates in CAISO markets, then the issuance must wait for monthly CAISO allocation data. And if not, it can continue to use its 2-week or sooner issuance policy. In addition, hourly tracking is also coming to Regis. So the allocation data should be reported monthly with an hourly granularity. And just to be clear, we're only proposing that Regis be sent information about Regis registered renewables that are allocated by CAISO through this framework on a resource specific basis. We're not proposing that Regis be sent null power data. That's not necessary. For Regis registered renewables that are designated as null power, the RECs do not need to be tagged since their attributes are not affected. Next slide. All right, so here's the proposal, our proposal for null power reporting in this framework. Again, CAISO should enable reporting on null power, which is generation from renewable resources without RECs, under this approach to make it as accurate as possible and to avoid conflicts with programs that allocate generation and emissions using RECs. And we present 3 options for reporting null power. The first and the preferred option is that CAISO requires REC information in order to allocate renewable generation resources on a specified basis, and that otherwise this generation is reported under this approach as null power. So that means proof of REC ownership by a reporting entity for owned and contracted generation, and proof of REC retirement on behalf of a residual mix if it is assigned to a residual mix. Otherwise, it is reported as null power in those places. So reporting entities would provide REC information to CAISO monthly. And across all options, we are proposing that null power volumes, as I showed in the example, are removed for the residual rate calculations for a null power adjusted residual mix emissions rate, and null power volumes in reporting entity allocations be assigned the null power adjusted residual rate. Again, providing a null power adjusted residual rate would deliver a more accurate emissions rate under a load-based GHG accounting framework. This adjustment would account for other specified transactions outside of the market and support states and consumers' need to factor REC transactions into their emissions accounting from purchased electricity. And we recommend that null power volumes be removed from the residual mix rather than assigned emissions. So next slide. So that was option 1. This is option 2. This is the second sort of less preferred option, and that is that REC information is not required by CAISO and null power reporting is optional and self-reported. This is what was selected for SPP's Markets Plus. In this case, there's a risk that some null power will go unreported. Some renewable energy will be reported by entities that don't own the RECs due to a reporting entity choosing not to report null power, or because it cannot be optionally reported as null by a participating reporting entity. As a result, the null power data in the market would not be entirely accurate. It would not match, for example, the total null power that could be calculated using Regis certificate data. However, per our proposal for reporting to Regis, Regis will have the data for the allocation of all registered renewables on a specified basis. So at least, even under this option, that will be transparent to REC owners and states if the generation associated with their REC has been allocated on a specified basis to a particular place or entity. Next slide, please. So the third option, which is preferred over the second, but not over the first, so the order would be 1, 3, and 2, is that the REC information and retirement information is required for generation allocated to a residual mix, either of a GHG pricing zone, a voluntary climate region, or the market residual mix, or a non-participating AA, but that REC information is not required and null power reporting is optional for generation allocated to a participating reporting entity. So while participating reporting entities can choose to report null power for their owned and contracted generation, the default assumption for renewables in residual mixes and non-participants is that the RECs are being kept by the generator, and unless proven otherwise, it is treated as null power by the market. So this option would at least avoid a situation wherein there is renewable generation in the residual mix that could be allocated to an LSE's unfulfilled load and assigned to unspecified power on a specified basis, while the associated RECs could be retained or sold to a specific entity. Next slide. So I'll just run through a few scenarios, and there are 10 different scenarios in the proposal document and the Appendix A, but I'll just highlight a few here one for owned and contracted generation, one for excess owned and contracted generation in a GHG pricing zone, and then for generation attributed to a GHG pricing zone but not allocated to a specific reporting entity, and finally for non-participating generation. So next slide. All right, so this is for owned and contracted generation. Under option 1, if REC ownership information is reported to CAISO by the reporting entity, then it's reported as specified and allocated to the reporting entity by CAISO, and then CAISO would share that data, that allocation data, with Regis. If REC ownership is not reported to CAISO, then it is reported as null power by CAISO under this framework, but there would be no reporting to Regis. Under option 2, they can still provide REC information to CAISO, in which case it's reported as specified, and that data is shared with Regis. If it's not reported to CAISO, then it may still be reported as specified and allocated to the reporting entity by CAISO on a specified basis, in which case, again, CAISO would share with Regis that data about how it was allocated. But there's a scenario where, under option 2, if the REC ownership information is not reported, that it may be reported as null power optionally by that entity due to this optional designation, and there would be no reporting to Regis. And option 3 in this case would be the same as option 2 for owned and contracted generation. Next slide. All right, so the next scenario is excess owned and contracted generation in a GHG pricing zone. So under option 1, if there is REC retirement on behalf of the GHG pricing zone residual mix, and that is reported to CAISO, then it can be reported as specified in the GHG pricing zone's residual mix by CAISO, in which case that information would be shared with Regis. If REC retirement on behalf of GHG pricing zone residual mix is not reported to CAISO, then it will be reported as null power. That's option 1. Option 2 is, again, if REC retirement information is provided, then is reported as specified in the GHG pricing zone residual mix. If it's not provided to CAISO, REC information is not reported, then it may still be reported as specified, in which case, again, it is shared as with Regis as specified in the residual mix. And if REC retirement on behalf of the GHG pricing zone is not reported, it may be optionally reported as null power by the reporting entity, in which case no reporting to Regis. In this case, option 3 is the same as option 1, since we're talking about designation to a residual mix. Next slide. So I just want to talk briefly about generation that's attributed to a GHG pricing zone, but not allocated to a specific reporting entity, and then non-participating generation real quickly. So renewable energy generation that's attributed or deemed to a GHG pricing zone in the market, but not allocated to a specific entity, would be, by my understanding, allocated to the residual mix for the zone. So under our proposal, options 1 and 3 would require retirement of the REC on behalf of the residual mix of the GHG pricing zone, for example, by the participating generator, in order for the generation to be allocated to the residual mix for the zone on a specified basis. Otherwise, it's reported as null power in the zone, in the zone's residual mix. Under option 2, since it cannot be optionally reported as null by a reporting entity, it will be associated, it will be allocated on a specified basis to the residual mix of the zone. And then per our recommendation about reporting to Regis, it would be reported to Regis as such, as specified in the residual mix of the zone. Next slide. So since a non-participating BAA will not provide REC information to CAISO, under options 1 and 3, any renewables in the generation that's allocated to a non-participating BAA will be reported as null power. Under option 2, it will not be optionally reported as null, and it will be allocated as specified to the non-participating BAA. And then as a result, will be reported to Regis as such. Next slide, please. Okay, so wrapping up here, finally, I just want to touch on two concerns that have come up in this subgroup and in the Markets Plus process, which are policy neutrality and confidentiality. Next slide, please. So first, policy neutrality. CAISO's accounting and reporting framework should provide allocation data in a transparent way without giving preference to a certain market participant or state or type of policy. So I want to address our proposals for coordinating and data sharing with Regis, and then requiring REC ownership or information for specified allocations, and providing a null power adjusted residual mix in the context of maintaining policy neutrality. And I want to talk about the advantages of these proposals for both REC-based programs and emissions accounting programs that don't use RECs. So first, on data sharing with Regis, coordination and data sharing with Regis does not set policy for any state or program or affect the ability of any state or market participant to do with that information what it wants. Even if market allocation information were to be added to Regis certificates as we propose, it would simply provide information to enable each state or program to make its own decisions regarding the eligibility of Regis certificates on the basis and using the market allocation to different reporting entities and the value that it might assign to that information. So regarding option 1 and 3, our proposal to, which is our proposal to require attribute ownership for allocation on a resource-specific basis. This would not constrain state requirements. Market allocation data can be used for programs or not, and in fact, provides the flexibility, the most flexibility to the most states, where attribute ownership is required for allocation by CAISO, but not required by a particular state or program, like Oregon's HB 2021, for example. LSEs could report specified procurement without attributes, without RECs, and use the market's residual mix. In this case, the LSE specific report or allocation through this framework would simply not be used for state reporting, and while the adjusted residual mix would account for RECs, it has the null power volume removed, but this is still preferable to using a default emissions factor for those programs, for example. And meanwhile, this framework would not double count for the states that do require the REC attributes. For example, CETA in Washington. On the other hand, if the framework allocates to reporting entities, regardless of REC ownership for Regis registered generation as the default, that will permit double counting for the states and programs that do require RECs for GHG accounting, CETA, LCFS, the voluntary market. In other words, requiring attribute ownership for allocation to reporting entities would not deny entities in states that don't require REC ownership any information that they require from the markets to calculate emissions, whereas not requiring ownership of attributes would deny to stakeholders in states that do require REC ownership vital data required to accurately calculate their emissions. And lastly, providing a null power adjusted residual mix also would not represent a policy position necessarily. Again, state policy that does not use or require RECs for load-based emissions accounting typically doesn't prohibit the provision of data that accounts for RECs and null power. And a residual mix that's adjusted for null power is preferable to a default emissions factor. Next slide. So finally, there have been some concerns about sharing data with Regis and tagging recs with allocation information related to confidentiality. The information provided by CAISO to Regis and potentially used by Regis to tag recs with CAISO allocation data would only be seen by the individual account holders of those recs and the program administrators, state program administrators. Furthermore, the Regis registered generators that have already agreed to use CAISO as the qualified reporting entity for generation data that's used for certificate issuance at Regis could simply agree to have CAISO share allocation data with Regis as well. In the future, if there is all generation certificate tracking in Regis, there may be other generators that would not agree to have their generation and allocation data shared in Regis. In other all generation tracking systems, like in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions, generators register for an account if they wish to have certificates created and issued to them, and they agree to have the market provide their generation data. Again, only they and the program administrators can see their account. For generators that are not registered, market data is still provided to the tracking system, but certificates are placed into the system administrator's account. And at the end of the trading period, those certificates are used for residual mix calculations. So there does not appear to be a perceived confidentiality issue in that case for the registered generators, even though their generator specific data is being shared with the tracking system. Next slide, please. I think that's the end of my presentation. Thank you again for allowing me the opportunity to present, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Todd. Taking a look here to see if we have any hands raised. I'm not seeing any coming in quite yet.
I just want to thank you, Todd, for putting together this presentation, for coming and sharing it with both the subgroup and this larger GHG working group. And I think what we're really interested in is, stakeholder feedback on the kind of reporting aspect and the null power reporting, to hear back that in terms of kind of alignment with states. And so you'll see that question in the comment template for the folks online. The comment questions have been posted both in the straw proposal itself and are also available in the tool. So maybe just taking another moment to see if any questions come up for Todd, since we have him here on the line.
I'm not seeing any questions.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you so much again.
All right, well, maybe we can move to next steps. We have our working group meeting today. Christina is going to review our comment timeline. We are looking to take this to our September 10th board. So really looking for your input on shaping the design of the straw proposal or understanding what changes stakeholders would like to see in order to have this implemented post EDM go live. And with that, I'll turn it over to Christina for some next steps. But thank you again all for your participation and engagement in this GHG working group.
Thank you, Anya. For next steps, comments on the straw proposal and the meeting are requested by June 12th, as Anya mentioned. The template is up already on the initiative webpage linked here. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to us at ISO-stakeholderaffairs@CAISO.com. Now I just have a few announcements before we wrap up. Here you can see some of the meetings taking place at the ISO this week. And here you can see trainings, market simulations, and business practice manual updates. And lastly, for insights into the ISO grid and market operations, be on the lookout for our Energy Matters blog, or you can always subscribe. And with that, we'd like to thank you so much for joining today's discussion. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only, and the video file will be posted on the initiative webpage. We thank you very much, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.